Welcome to AERO 2230, presentation number 6 on airspace. Airspace is very complicated, but this chart makes it a little easier to understand, especially if you're visually oriented. Class G airspace is uncontrolled airspace, and the visibility requirements for VFR flight in Class G is 1 statute mile visibility, and you need to stay clear of clouds up to 1,200 feet above ground level, or AGL. And you can fly in Class G airspace with a student pilot certificate or better. Class E airspace is controlled airspace, and the visibility requirements for VFR in Class E airspace are 3 statute miles visibility, and also cloud clearance of 500 below, 1,000 above, and 2,000 horizontally. And you can fly in Class Echo airspace with a student pilot certificate or better. Class Delta airspace is around a small airport with a control tower. It's controlled airspace, and again, visibility requirements for VFR flight in Class Delta is 3 statute miles visibility, and 500 below, 1,000 above, and 2,000 horizontally from clouds. You can fly in Class Delta airspace with a student pilot certificate or better, but you do need permission from the control tower to enter the Class D airspace. Class C airspace are a little bigger and busier airport than Class D or Class Delta. Class C or Class Charlie airspace is controlled, and the visibility requirements for VFR flight are 3 statute miles and remain 500 below, 1,000 above, or 2,000 horizontally from clouds. You can fly in Class Charlie airspace with a student pilot certificate or better, but you must have permission to enter Class Charlie airspace, and you must have a Mode C transponder. Class Bravo airspace is around very large airports, usually commercial airports that have a control tower, so they are controlled. Visibility requirements are a little less stringent, 3 statute miles visibility, and all you need to do is stay clear of clouds, so there's no distance required from clouds. And also you need at least a private certificate to fly in Class Bravo airspace, unless you have special permission as a student pilot. But all pilots need to receive a clearance or get permission to enter Class Bravo airspace, and also you must have a Mode C transponder. Class A airspace, or Alpha airspace, is all controlled, and you cannot fly VFR in Class A airspace. So you need an instrument rating, you need instrument equipment, and an instrument clearance in order to fly in Class A. Then there are other rules for transponders. Victor Airways, which are airways between VORs, also have different rules. It's Class E airspace in a Victor Airway. We can see more detail about airspace on a terminal area chart or a TAC chart, and we can find flyway charts. We'll discuss special VFR and airspeed limits as well. So it's important for you as a pilot to know your airspace. You must be proficient at identifying airspace just by looking at a sectional. And there's some help on the sectional in the legend to show you the symbology to identify the different airspace. There are 2 categories of airspace. One is regulatory, the other is non-regulatory. And in the U.S., the regulatory airspace includes restricted areas, prohibited areas, and then Class A, B, C, D, and E airspace. These are where the FAA regulations apply. So if you violate an FAA regulation in this regulated airspace, you are subject to a citation, and you may lose your privileges. Non-regulatory airspace includes military operations areas, or MOAs, warning areas, alert areas, and controlled firing areas. And we'll talk a little bit about the special use airspace later on in the presentation. Non-regulatory airspace are regions where the FAA can't enforce their regulations. And for example, the FAA can't restrict aircraft outside of U.S. airspace. So again, there are two categories of airspace, regulatory and non-regulatory. And within these two categories, there are four types: controlled, uncontrolled, special use airspace, and then other airspace. So we've talked about Class A, B, C, D, E, and G airspace. Let's start by looking at special use airspace as one of the subcategories. So you can find all of this special use airspace in the AIM, or the Aeronautical Information Manual, in Section 4. Section 4 will give you general information about special use airspace. It will define prohibited areas and how to identify it on the sectional chart, restricted areas, warning areas, military operation areas, alert areas, and controlled firing areas. Prohibited areas, restricted areas, and warning areas are all identified by blue hatched marks. And you can see here, this is restricted area 2907. It's identified on the map with the blue hatches, and also R2907. Prohibited area P50, that's the area around Camp David in Maryland. So you can identify these areas with the blue hatched lines. Military operating areas are identified with magenta hatched lines. So it's important to distinguish between these two because there are different rules. Alert areas, again, magenta hatched lines. And the only special use airspace that's not shown on the chart are called controlled firing areas. Other airspace, airport advisory areas, published VFR routes or airways like flyways, VFR corridors, or VFR transition routes, military training routes, terminal radar service areas or TERSAs, parachute jump operations, and national security areas. And then finally, temporary flight restrictions are all known as other airspace. Here's a table to make it easy for you to see the different entry requirements for different classes of airspace, the different equipment that's required, and also minimum pilot certificate required. And Class Alpha is the first one. You need an air traffic control clearance to enter Class Alpha airspace. Your airplane needs to be IFR equipped, and you need an instrument rating in order to fly in Class Alpha. In Class Bravo, you still need an air traffic control clearance, so you need to hear the words "cleared into Class Bravo" before you can enter the airspace. If you don't hear those words, then you cannot enter Class Bravo airspace. You need to establish two-way radio contact, and you need to have a transponder with altitude reporting capabilities, in other words, Mode C transponder. And the minimum pilot qualifications is a private pilot to enter Class Bravo or better. But if you're a student or recreational pilot, you can operate at other than a primary airport if you're seeking private pilot certification. In other words, you're going through training. Or if regulatory requirements are met. In other words, you receive proper training from a CFI and you get an endorsement in your logbook that says you're qualified to enter specific Class Bravo airspace. Class Charlie airspace, all you need to do is establish two-way radio contact with air traffic control before you enter. You don't need to hear clearance or cleared into Class Charlie. But you need to make sure that you understand how they establish two-way radio contact in Class Charlie airspace. When you call ATC to enter Class Charlie, if they read your tail number back to you, then you've established two-way radio contact. But if you don't hear your tail number or you don't hear your call sign, then you have not established two-way radio contact. So if you call ATC, let's say you call Nashville Approach, and Nashville Approach says aircraft calling Nashville Approach, stand by, that is not establishing two-way radio contact. They have not repeated back your tail number. So you need to establish two-way radio contact. You need a two-way radio, of course, transponder with altitude reporting capability. And there really isn't a specific requirement in Class Charlie airspace for minimum pilot qualifications. So you can be a student pilot, you can be a private pilot, a recreational pilot to enter Class Charlie. Class Delta airspace, you only need two-way radio communications. So all you have to do is establish two-way radio contact with ATC. So all you need is a two-way radio. You don't need an altitude reporting capability transponder or mode C transponder. And again, there's no specific minimum pilot certificate required. Class Echo, there is no entry requirement for VFR flight. So if you're on a visual flight and you are in Class Charlie, there's no specific equipment requirements and there's no minimum pilot certificate. And the same for Class Golf. Here's a nice table to help you remember the VFR weather minimums for each class of airspace. Starts with Class Alpha. Class A airspace doesn't have any VFR requirements because you cannot fly VFR in Class A airspace. Class Bravo airspace, the minimum visibility is 3 statute miles, and all you need to do is stay clear of clouds. Class Charlie, the minimum visibility again is 3 statute miles, but as far as clouds are concerned, you need to maintain at least 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet horizontal. Class Delta airspace, again, 3 statute miles visibility is required to be VFR, and 1,000 above, 500 below, and 2,000 horizontal from clouds. Class Echo airspace is a little more complicated. At or above 10,000 feet, MSL, mean sea level, you need to maintain at least 5 statute miles visibility, and also 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, and 1 statute mile horizontal from clouds. And then less than 10,000 feet gets a little less stringent. 3 statute miles visibility, 1,000 above, 500 below, and 2,000 feet horizontal. The reason for that is above 10,000 feet you're usually flying with some very fast airplanes, and so the reasoning is you need more space between you and those airplanes, and also between you and clouds, because those airplanes may be flying out of those clouds. And then Class G is probably the most complicated. For 1,200 feet or less above the surface, and that's regardless of mean sea level. So if you're in a high elevation airport, it's still 1,200 feet above ground level. In the day, all you have to do is maintain 1 statute miles visibility and stay clear of clouds. So what does that do for pilots in the Class Golf airspace? Well, you can take off and stay in the pattern and do some pattern work. At night, though, the visibility requirement goes up to 3 statute miles, and you need to stay 1,000 feet above, 500 below, and 2,000 feet horizontal from clouds. More than 1,200 feet above the surface, but less than 10,000 feet MSL. During the day, 1 statute mile visibility is required, and 1,000 above, 500 below, and 2,000 feet horizontal clearance from clouds. And then at night it goes up to 3 statute miles with the same clearance from clouds. More than 1,200 feet above the surface and at or above 10,000 feet MSL, the visibility goes up to 5 statute miles, 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, and 1 statute mile horizontal from clouds. So the National Airspace System is a hierarchical layout. In other words, from Class A down to Class G, you have most restrictive Class A airspace, where you cannot have any VFR operations. And then Class Bravo is very restrictive. We only have 31 airports in the United States that are classified as Class Bravo. And then Class Charlie is restrictive. Again, you need a radio and mode C transponder, but not as restrictive as Class Bravo. You don't need a clearance to get into Class Charlie. Class Delta is restrictive, but really minor restrictions. You don't need a mode C transponder. There is a control tower at Class D airspace, but other than that, the restrictions are few. And then Class Echo, very few restrictions. It is controlled airspace, but there are no equipment requirements, no minimum pilot certification, no clearance requirements. And Class Golf, Class G, finally, is the least restrictive. You're close to the ground. Usually there's no tower involved. So Class Golf, again, is the least restrictive airspace. So you can think of Class Golf or Class G airspace as any airspace that's not designated Class A, B, C, D, or E airspace. It's uncontrolled. There's no pilot certification required, no specific minimum. There's no specific equipment required. And there are visibility requirements, VFR visibility requirements, but fairly easy to comply. It might make it easier to remember the visibility requirements for VFR flight in Class G airspace if you divide it up into 2 classes: low altitude Class G airspace and high altitude Class G airspace. At 1,200 feet or less above the surface, the minimum visibility is 1 statute mile, and all you have to do is remain clear of clouds. But above 1,200 feet and below 10,000 feet MSL, the minimum visibility is 1 statute miles, but you have to remain clear of clouds, 500 below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontal. High altitude Class G is more than 1,200 feet above the surface and at or above 10,000 feet MSL. And the minimum visibility goes up to 5 statute miles at that altitude. Minimum cloud clearance is 1,000 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 1 mile horizontal. Generally speaking, if airspace is not Class A, B, C, or D, and it's above 700 feet AGL or 1,200 feet AGL, it's Class E airspace. You can have transition areas from Class Golf to Class E airspace or Echo airspace shown on the sectional. If you see a magenta colored fade, then the floor of the Class Echo airspace in that area is 700 feet above ground level. If you see a blue fade, then the surface or the floor of the Class Echo airspace is 1,200 feet. There's no specific pilot certification required to fly in this airspace, and no equipment is required either. But you do have to maintain VFR visibility and cloud separation requirements. Again, it might be easy to remember the VFR weather minimums by dividing up the Class Echo airspace into low altitude and high altitude. Below 10,000 feet MSL, or mean sea level, the minimum visibility is 3 statute miles, and cloud clearance is 500 below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontal. But above 10,000 feet MSL, the minimum visibility goes up to 5 statute miles, and cloud clearance goes up to 1,000 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 1 mile horizontal. Class D airspace is designated around airports that have a control tower, but aren't very busy. Class D airspace looks like a hockey puck. It's just a round circle. And the circle is a 4 nautical mile radius. Class D airspace is depicted on sectional charts with a blue dashed circle. And the ceiling is always noted within the circle on the sectional, so you know how high the Class Delta airspace is. The entry requirements for Class Delta airspace are pretty simple. You should contact the Class Delta tower before entering the Class Delta airspace, so far enough out so that you can establish the two-way radio contact before you get to the airspace. And the pilot should contact the control tower on the published frequency. You can find the frequency on the sectional chart or in the chart supplement. When you call, all you need to do is give your position, whether you're east, west, north, south, and how many miles out, your altitude, and your destination if you're planning on landing at that Class Delta airport, for example, and then any requests. The Class Charlie airspace is designated around busier airports. The structure of Class Charlie airspace looks like an upside down 2-layer cake, or some people call it an upside down wedding cake. It's depicted on a chart, on the sectional charts, with magenta lines, a solid magenta line, with one magenta line, a circle inside of another magenta line circle. The ceiling height and the floor height of each Class Charlie airspace layer is shown on the sectional chart in hundreds of feet MSL, mean sea level. The entry requirements are fairly simple for Class Charlie. You just need to establish two-way radio contact with air traffic control. You need an altitude encoding transponder or a Mode C or Mode S transponder. And you contact approach usually within 20 miles of the airspace. You can find that in the AIM, or the Aeronautical Information Manual. Class B airspace is typically around very big airports, so think B for big and busy. And the structure again resembles an upside down wedding cake of 3 layers or more, but the shape varies depending on the needs of the airspace. There are 31 Class Bravo airspace airports in the U.S., and they're depicted on the chart with solid blue lines with concentric circles. The ceiling height and the floor height of each Class Bravo airspace layer is also shown on the sectional in hundreds of feet MSL. So to enter Class Bravo airspace, you also need to establish two-way radio communication, but you need to get permission to enter the Class Bravo airspace. So you need to hear the words "cleared to enter Class Bravo." You need a Mode C or a Mode S transponder for altitude encoding, and in some cases you need at least a private pilot certificate or higher to fly in Class Bravo airspace. Some Class Bravo airspace will not allow student pilots at all. And visibility requirements are simple. You just need to stay clear of clouds and maintain at least 3 statute miles visibility. There is a Mode C veil or airspace that surrounds Class Bravo airspace, and while it's not within the Class Bravo airspace, you still must have a Mode C transponder or an altitude encoding transponder while flying in this airspace. Airplanes that are certified without an electrical system like gliders, balloons, are exempt from the altitude encoding transponder requirement, when flying in the Mode C airspace. As you can see in this picture of the sectional chart of the Orlando Airport in Orlando, Florida, you can see the Class Bravo airspace depicted by these blue solid lines. But outside of these blue solid lines you see this magenta line. That's called the Mode C veil. Within this line, even if you're not in the Class Bravo airspace, you still need to have a Mode C transponder. And that's to give the air traffic controllers information about your altitude so that they can keep you separated from approaching traffic. Class A airspace is from 18,000 feet up, or flight level 180. And the ceiling is at 60,000 feet MSL, or at flight level 600. Class A airspace is over the entire U.S. and is conducted under instrument flight rules only. VFR flight is not permitted in Class A airspace. Now there's other airspace known as special use airspace, and ATC can put limitations on aircraft while in special use airspace. Special use airspace is depicted on sectional charts except for control firing areas and temporary flight restrictions. There are many different special use airspace types. They include national security areas, temporary flight restrictions, prohibited areas, restricted areas, and warning areas, MOAs or military operating areas, alert areas, Victor airways, and military training routes. Each one of these is depicted on the sectional chart as we discussed before, except for the temporary flight restrictions and also controlled firing areas. There are different rules that apply to each one of these. For example, prohibited areas, you are, as a pilot, a private pilot, never allowed into a prohibited area. Restricted areas, however, you can fly into a restricted area as long as it's not active. Military operating areas, again, you are, just like restricted areas, allowed to fly in an MOA as long as it's not active. So it's important for you to understand the rules for each one of these special use airspace designations. One of the most important special use airspace areas is a temporary flight restriction. And these become more and more common, especially during election years. They're added to the system by what's called an FDC NOTAM. Those are regulatory NOTAMs. So if you violate a temporary flight restriction, since it's regulatory, you can receive a citation, you can lose your license. It's not depicted on sectionals, so it's very important for you to keep up to date on any FDC NOTAMs issued for the area that you'll be flying in. You want to check before every flight to make sure that there are no TFRs in your area, because they can appear with very little notice. Some common ones are due to presidential visits or presidential movement. Also major sporting events can result in a TFR. So check with the flight service station before your flight. So that's the end of presentation number 6 on airspace and the end of Module 1. Next we'll have a test on the Module 1 material. So make sure that you've completed the quizzes before moving on. And if you have any questions or you need any help, there'll be a Zoom meeting before the test. The day of the test will be listed on the calendar, so make sure that you check the calendar for the day of the test. And good luck!